He stood alone outside the chapel, dust clinging to his shoes, the sun carving shadows across a sharp blue sky as mourners slipped past him without so much as a glance. His hands held a folded flag, worn at the edges, cradled like something sacred, yet no one asked his name, no one offered a seat. And when he stepped forward, just once, to glimpse the woman he had loved and lost, they stopped him cold. To them, he was just another black man standing where he didn't belong, dressed in a uniform they didn't believe he earned, holding grief they thought was borrowed. What happened next would ignite a storm that shook a city and expose the kind of truth systems are built to hide. But for 7 minutes, no one knew who he was, and that was the most dangerous mistake they could have made. Before we begin, hit that like button, subscribe for more stories that challenge the silence, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We want to hear your voice, because stories like this are meant to be remembered. The sun blazed overhead, sharp and unrelenting against the pale stone steps of Belridge Memorial Chapel. Outside the gate, Osric Vance stood like a statue, not out of pride, but out of duty. His dress blues were perfect, buttons gleaming, boots shined to a mirror polish, medals straight across his chest. The crisp American flag folded tightly in his gloved hands didn't tremble, even as the breeze kicked up dust around his polished shoes. His jaw was clenched tight, his breath even, his eyes locked on the front doors where his wife's casket would be wheeled in any moment. Today wasn't supposed to be complicated. Today was about saying goodbye. Rosalie Vance, beloved schoolteacher, wife of a United States Marine. They'd been together 23 years. Her dying wish, that he escort her in full uniform, just once more for the burial. That promise had carried Osric through the chemotherapy, the quiet hospice hours, the nights she cried into his lap. Now, at the gate to the chapel, an officer in a crisp blue precinct uniform stepped directly into his path. The officer looked to be in his mid-20s, white, buzz-cut, jaw tense like he was prepping for war. His name tag read Simmons. He narrowed his eyes, sizing up Osric not as a man in mourning, but as a potential threat. "You need to step back, sir," Simmons said, one hand already moving toward his belt, hovering between his taser and baton. "This is a closed event." Osric didn't move. "I'm here for the funeral," he said, holding the invitation forward, formal black script on ivory paper. "I'm the widower." Simmons took the paper and frowned. "Widower, huh?" He tilted the card as if it might reveal some hidden lie, then abruptly tore it in half and let the pieces fall to the sidewalk. "Could be fake," he muttered. "You got ID?" Osric's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. He reached for his wallet slowly, every movement measured to avoid escalation. He handed over his military ID. Simmons glanced at it, blinked, then laughed without humor. "Just because you got one of these doesn't mean you're legit. People buy these online all the time." Osric swallowed hard. "I served 30 years, he said. "This is my wife's funeral. Her name is Rosalie Vance. This is Belridge Chapel. I arranged the service." Simmons stepped back and pressed his shoulder mic. "Dispatch, this is Officer Simmons at Belridge. I've got a black male at the front gate in what appears to be a Marine uniform. Claims he's attending a funeral. Possible impersonator. Request backup." Osric's body tensed, not with fear, but with something deeper, familiar, a kind of helplessness he hadn't felt since the day he stood at Dover Air Force Base, saluting flag-draped coffins coming home. Except now, he wasn't a soldier mourning brothers in arms. He was a husband trying to mourn his wife and being treated like a criminal. 2 more officers arrived within minutes. They flanked him without a word. Sergeant Kolchak, older, thicker, with permanent scowl lines between his eyes, took the lead. "Name?" he asked curtly. "Osric Vance," Osric repeated. Kolchak scanned the guest list on his clipboard. "No Vance here." "Got a Vaughn. You sure you're at the right chapel?" Osric nodded once. "Check the records. I arranged this funeral." "Look," Kolchak said, glancing at the uniform. "We've had protesters try stuff like this before, where fake medals crash the event, make a scene. You want to honor your service? Don't disgrace someone else's." "I'm not a protester," Osric said. "That's my wife inside." Kolchak rolled his eyes. "Step away from the gate." "I promised her," Osric said quietly. "I promised I'd walk with her." You can walk to the sidewalk, Kolchak snapped. Or you can walk to the back of a squad car. Your choice. Osric looked around. People were arriving now. Some glanced his way, curious. A few frowned. A woman walked past and muttered, "Why can't they just respect private events?" Her husband nodded in agreement. Osric stood his ground, but Simmons stepped forward. "That's it. You've had your say." He pushed Osric in the chest, hard enough to make him take a step back. The flag nearly slipped from Osric's hand. His breath caught. That flag had draped the bed where Rosalie died. It had lain across her legs as her breathing slowed. It had soaked in the scent of morphine and flowers. He stepped forward, fixing Simmons with a quiet stare. "Don't touch me again." Kolchak's eyes darkened. "Resisting." "No," Osric said. "I'm standing still." But it didn't matter. Simmons raised his voice. "Resisting," he yelled to the two other officers. Possible threat. In seconds, they closed in. Osric's arms were grabbed, twisted behind his back. The flag hit the sidewalk. His knees bent slightly under the pressure. "This man's trying to disrupt a service," Simmons announced to the gathering crowd. "We've had warnings. Best to keep moving, folks." An elderly couple walked past, shaking their heads at Osric. "Shameful," one whispered. Osric didn't fight. He didn't plead. He let the cuffs click shut over his wrists and stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched, eyes burning. Then someone across the street, just a kid, pointed his phone and laughed. "Yo, check this out. Dude in a costume trying to crash a funeral." His legs were numb from kneeling, and his fingers throbbed from where he'd clutched the folded flag until it bent against his ribs. Now the flag rested in his lap, creased and soiled from where it had touched the gutter. The scent of gasoline and earth clung to it. Osric stared through the black metal bars of the chapel's gate as the funeral service moved forward without him. Inside, through stained glass windows half-shielded by long red curtains, he could see shadows pass across pews. The organ's deep notes filtered faintly through the thick chapel walls. Voices inside spoke softly, a controlled grief rising and falling like distant waves. None of those voices were his. He was invisible now, an outsider to his own life. When the chapel doors finally creaked open, it wasn't for him. Pallbearers emerged slowly into the sunlight, carrying Rosalie's casket. Osric stood up quickly, brushing his trousers and adjusting his medals, trying to look composed despite the ache in his joints. He stepped toward the gate. This was his moment, the one his wife had asked for. She had wanted him beside her, wanted the man she loved, the man who had come home from war carrying pieces of others, to walk her to rest. He gripped the flag tighter, chin up. But the doors closed again before he could take another step. "Back away," a voice behind him growled. It was Simmons again, face hard with suspicion. "You're not part of the procession. If you take one more step, you'll be removed again." "I'm her husband," Osric said, not loudly, not pleading. Just fact. But facts didn't matter here. Truth didn't carry the weight it used to. Simmons didn't reply. He turned back toward the chapel, muttering something into his shoulder. Mike Osric stood motionless for a moment longer, watching through the narrow space between the iron bars. Then he lowered the flag, stepped back to the edge of the sidewalk, and watched as strangers did the job he had promised to do. The funeral director had been briefed. Osric had called him personally weeks in advance. Military honors, flag protocol, a photo of Rosalie in her teaching gown, smiling, the one she had loved most. But when the eulogies began and the service programs were handed out, Rosalie's picture was missing. Instead, a generic floral cover adorned the paper, with her name replaced by beloved sister, friend, and teacher. No mention of wife. No mention of Marine spouse. No folded flag rested on her casket. No honor guard stood watch. The ceremonial rifle salute Osric had requested, denied, citing short notice. The organist played hymns she had never liked. Her voice was never mentioned. Her favorite poem, the one Osric had chosen to read, sat unused, buried in the email chain the director never acknowledged. As mourners filtered out between service segments, Osric remained in place, uninvited and unacknowledged. A woman in a gray shawl, clutching a designer purse, looked him up and down as she exited, and then turned to the man beside her with a smirk. "Is he part of the cleanup crew or something?" she asked, loud enough for him to hear. "Maybe security?" Her companion laughed. "I didn't know they hired actors for these things." Neither of them waited for an answer. They walked past, eyes scanning for their luxury sedan among the rows of parked cars. Osric didn't react. He couldn't afford to. Every time someone passed, he straightened his back, adjusted the medals on his chest, and held the flag close like a shield. But the hits kept coming, not in blows but in slights, the deliberate kind, sharpened with indifference. A group of middle-aged men in press suits, wearing fraternity pins, stood 10 feet away, chatting about market shifts and home values. One of them glanced toward Osric and said, "I thought he was supposed to be in the chapel. Guess he didn't make the list." Another mourner, a distant cousin of Rosalie's, stepped outside to smoke and barely concealed his confusion. "Wait, is that Osric?" he asked someone behind him. "Huh, I thought he'd be inside, not whatever this is." Then he shrugged and went back to checking his phone. The chapel's large wooden doors swung wide again, revealing a new cluster of guests heading toward the reception hall across the lot. Osric didn't move. He could see now that Rosalie's casket had already been moved toward the rear corridor, away from where he stood, away from any last salute he had rehearsed. A pair of altar boys carried candles and a cross. They stepped carefully across the marble floor, their gazes never leaving the path ahead. The final rites were happening, and he wasn't part of it. His absence wasn't an oversight. It was engineered. When the chapel emptied, the funeral director emerged, clipboard in hand, already dialing a number. Osric stepped toward him. "You didn't use her photo," Osric said. "You removed the flag protocol. There was no mention of me, no acknowledgement. Why?" The man didn't stop walking. "Sorry, sir, but I'm very busy. I have another service in 30 minutes. "You ignored everything I arranged," Osric said, his voice level but growing firmer. "I submitted the paperwork. You confirmed it. Why?" "Frankly," the director said, stopping just long enough to glance at Osric, "we had concerns about potential disruptions, given recent events. We thought it best to keep things simple, respectful." "Is that what you call this?" Osric asked, lifting the stained flag an inch. The director's phone rang. He answered it and walked away without responding. Osric stood alone again. The sky had clouded over. The temperature had dropped. The wind cut through his uniform like it didn't recognize who he was anymore. The voices around him faded as cars pulled away, one by one. Eventually, the courtyard was empty except for a maintenance truck reversing toward the rear. A young worker jumped out, dragging bins across the gravel. He looked at Osric, paused, and said, "You need something, man?" The church staff had begun cleaning up, folding chairs and rolling tables through the arched breezeway that led to the reception hall. Mourners long gone. Cars vanished. The silence that remained was unnatural, heavy with the kind of weight Osric hadn't felt since the slow aftermath of an ambush overseas. He turned to leave, to retreat from the edge of this carefully engineered isolation, when a voice barked from behind him. "Sir, we need you to stop right there." Officer Simmons had returned, flanked now by two more uniformed officers, neither of whom Osric had seen earlier. One held a clipboard, the other a camera, already turned on and pointed directly at him. Osric froze, then slowly turned around, his stance straight and restrained. "What now?" he asked, his tone more weary than confrontational. Simmons stepped forward, eyes narrowed. "There's been a report that someone matching your description was seen interfering with funeral logistics earlier, touching equipment, possibly harassing staff." Osric blinked, unsure if this was a deliberate lie or just the next chapter of a system trying to break him down. "That's not true," he replied evenly. "I haven't left this spot since the service began. I haven't spoken to anyone except your officers." The man with the clipboard approached, already filling out a form. "We're going to need to confirm that. In the meantime, I'm going to ask that you remove your jacket and place it on the ground." Osric's eyes narrowed, confused. "My jacket." "Standard procedure," the officer replied without flinching. You're wearing what appears to be an official U.S. military uniform. Until we verify your status, you'll be asked to remove it. We can't have impersonators near sensitive locations." "I already showed ID," Osric said, gesturing slightly toward his inner pocket. "I served 30 years. You want to know my record? Ask the Pentagon." Simmons folded his arms. "Then you got nothing to worry about, right? Comply, and we'll get this sorted." Osric didn't move for a long moment. The gravel beneath his shoes shifted slightly as he adjusted his stance. He was tired. Tired of being accused, questioned, doubted. But more than that, he was tired of watching them chip away pieces of his dignity in full view of a world that refused to care. Slowly, reluctantly, he unfastened his jacket. The stiff fabric gave as he slipped one arm out, then the other. The breeze chilled his now exposed shirt sleeves. He folded the jacket neatly, even then, and laid it on the sidewalk like something sacred. The metals clinked faintly as they touched the stone. "Happy?" he asked. "Not quite," Simmons replied. "Kneel. Hands behind your head." The words hung in the air like a gunshot. Osric's face remained expressionless, but the silence that followed said more than words ever could. "This is a routine inspection," the clipboard officer added. "We've had reports of stolen valor in this region. You should understand, sir, it's not personal." Osric thought of Rosalie again, of her soft hands smoothing this very jacket over his shoulders just days ago, whispering that he still looked like a soldier, even after everything. Now her words rang hollow under the hard gaze of men who had already decided he wasn't who he claimed to be. "Get on your knees," Simmons repeated, this time more forcefully. Osric looked around, at the empty chapel, at the lowered flag in his arms, at the cement ground where flower petals still lay crushed beneath footsteps that hadn't been his. He knelt. The gravel dug through the fabric of his trousers, sharp and unrelenting against his kneecaps. He laced his fingers behind his head, the position instinctive from years of training that apparently meant nothing here. A silence followed, broken only by the sound of the camera beeping to life. "Recording," said the second officer. Osric kept his eyes straight ahead. The breeze made the metals on his jacket rattle slightly. He heard footsteps again. A group of teenagers had gathered across the street, phones out, faces twisted into amused confusion. One of them raised his voice. "Yo, why they got that old dude kneeling like he's getting jumped?" Another laughed. "Is this a TikTok challenge or something?" Osric closed his eyes. The laughter was worse than the kneeling, worse than the silence, because it confirmed what he feared most. No one would question what was happening. They would just watch, record, and scroll. One of the officers leaned down beside him, holding his phone up and snapping a photo. "For the record," he said. Osric turned slightly and caught the screen as it lit up, the frame capturing him in uniform, kneeling on gravel, fingers laced behind his head, flag at his side. The officer chuckled. "My brother's not gonna believe this. Said we'd never find one in real life." Osric kept his face still. He thought of fire teams and forward operating bases, of the sound of choppers lifting into orange-tinted skies. He thought of the nights he sat awake with Rosalie after bad dreams, of the times he promised her their sacrifice had made a difference. But here, all that history had been reduced to a punchline. "A spectacle. Stand up," Simmons ordered after what felt like forever. Osric slowly complied, knees popping as he rose. The gravel stuck to the fabric of his trousers. He picked up his jacket, brushing the metals gently with one hand, but made no move to put it back on. "You can go," Simmons said. "For now. We'll be keeping an eye on you. Try not to linger." "That's all I've done," Osric replied quietly. "I lingered." Simmons ignored him. Osric took one last look at the chapel behind him, now entirely dark. The flowers had been removed. The candles snuffed out. His wife's casket gone, lowered into the ground without his final salute, without his prayer. He turned and walked slowly down the sidewalk, the folded flag pressed tight to his side, his medals cold in his hand. Behind him, laughter echoed again. The folded flag was pressed tightly against his side, His fingers sore from clutching it so long, the edges of the fabric still stained with street dust and damp from the gutter. His jacket hung over his arm now, limp and creased, the metals clinking faintly with each movement, a soft, sorrowful sound that seemed at odds with the weight behind it. He didn't feel like a Marine anymore. He didn't feel like a husband. He felt like a ghost that no one could see except when they wanted something to laugh at. His legs ached from kneeling on gravel, and the quiet bruises forming along his ribs from being restrained without reason throbbed with each breath. The sidewalk led toward the rear of the chapel, where he knew the funeral director would be overseeing the final cleanup. That man owed him answers. After stripping the ceremony of everything Osric had requested, after erasing Rosalie's name from the programs and refusing the military rights he had secured, he owed at least a moment of explanation, if not respect. Osric approached the rear staff entrance, stepping over a rolled-up tarp and several catering trays stacked along the wall. The funeral staff milled about lazily, wiping tables and collecting floral stands. None of them acknowledged him until he knocked on the office door with the back of his knuckles. The sound echoed slightly. A young woman inside looked up and then frowned, clearly surprised to see him again. "He's not here," she said quickly, her tone cold, dismissive. "The director's already left." Osric didn't move. "Then get me someone who can tell me why my wife's service was rearranged without notice," he said, his voice controlled, quiet but firm, the way he had spoken to young Marines before they stepped off into danger. "I'm her husband. I'm entitled to answers." The woman's eyes darted past him. Footsteps approached fast from behind. A rough hand clamped onto Osric's shoulder and spun him around. Simmons again. "Of course. Didn't we tell you to leave?" Simmons snapped. What part of that was unclear? Osric didn't step back, didn't raise his hands. He simply pointed toward the door. "I'm trying to speak to the person in charge. That man erased my wife's honors. He stripped our ceremony without telling me. I just want to know why." Simmons's lip curled. "That's not your call anymore. You were removed for a reason. Now back off before I decide you're interfering with a business operation." Osric shook his head, the muscles in his jaw tightening. "I buried my wife today, and you're talking to me like I'm looting the place." His voice cracked slightly on the word wife, the grief leaking through before he could stop it. Simmons stepped in closer. "You're raising your voice." "No," Osric said slowly. "I'm grieving." "You're resisting," Simmons snapped, and without warning, he grabbed Osric's arm, twisted it behind his back, and slammed him forward onto the hood of the nearby police cruiser. Osric grunted as metal met his ribcage. His body stretched across the sun-warmed hood, the flag in his hand dropping to the pavement. His free hand tried instinctively to brace against the car, but Simmons pushed down harder, pinning him in place. Another officer moved in, taking Osric's other wrist and cuffing him for the second time that day. Around them, no one intervened. The staff walked faster, eyes on their tasks. The sound of a distant lawnmower hummed behind the building, oblivious. "You had your chance," Simmons hissed, adjusting the cuffs too tightly. "You blew it." Osric lay still, trying to breathe, the heat from the car seeping into his cheek. The flag rested near the curb, half unfolded now, exposed to the dirt and oil of the parking lot. His metals jangled against the cruiser's surface, no longer symbols of service, just noise. A third officer stood nearby, chuckling to himself. He lit a cigarette, took a long drag, and said, "This guy thinks he's the damn mayor or something. You see those shoes? Bet he buffed them himself." He walked over and casually kicked the toe of Osric's shoe, knocking dust onto the polished leather. "Not so shiny now, are they?" Another officer, one Osric hadn't seen earlier, wandered to the corner of the lot and unzipped his fly. He began urinating on the brick wall not 10 feet from where Osric was restrained. The stream splattered against the base of the chapel, darkening the stone. He glanced toward Osric and grinned. "Guess some folks just don't know when to stay in their place," he said, shaking off and zipping back up. Simmons finally pulled Osric upright and shoved him into the back of the cruiser. The door slammed shut, sealing Osric inside the hot metal box. He could barely move with his hands cuffed behind his back. The cruiser smelled of stale sweat and plastic. His jacket and the flag remained outside on the ground. Through the glass, he watched the officers laugh, joke, and gather near the rear staff entrance. A few took turns checking their phones. Someone held up Osric's jacket and examined the medals like they were trinkets from a novelty shop. His breathing slowed. In the claustrophobic silence of the cruiser, Osric leaned his head back against the seat. He thought about Rosalie, about her laugh, about the way she used to say he looked like a hero when he stood in uniform, the same way she'd smile and whisper that he gave her safety just by being there. He had promised her he'd be strong that day. He had promised to represent them both with pride. But now he was caged in the back of a patrol car, surrounded by men who couldn't see past his skin or uniform or silence. No one had stopped it. No one had spoken up. He didn't know how long he sat in the cruiser before someone opened the door again. "We're letting you go," Simmons said. "No charges. You're not worth the paperwork." He hadn't noticed that another police unit had followed from a distance, headlights dimmed, parked quietly along the curb. Officers watched him like a stray animal. Some recorded him. Others leaned back in their seats, unconcerned. Osric didn't speak. He stood quietly, waiting for the final procession, the part of the ceremony where the casket was brought to the grave, where the family stood behind the hearse, where he was supposed to be, where he belonged. The folded flag now rested on a bench beside him, its edges worn and dirted beyond anything that resembled ceremonial respect. His jacket remained missing, still clutched or discarded by someone who saw his medals as props or entertainment. The sun was lower now, shadows long and crawling across the pavement. Then he heard it, the low, throaty hum of the hearse pulling forward around the chapel's far wing. He turned toward the sound, his heart tightening in his chest, his hands still bruised and numb. The sight of the black vehicle hit harder than he expected. Rosalie was in there, still. The ceremony may have moved on without him. The crowd might have scattered, but that was still her. And he had made a promise, a final salute, one last gesture of honor for a woman who had stood beside him through war, trauma, and all the battles no one had seen. As the hearse slowed and began its turn toward the grave path, Osric straightened. His shoulders pulled back, his chin rose, and his spine aligned in a perfect line from boot to brow. His hands, though stiff and damaged, moved instinctively behind his back. Then, as the vehicle inched closer, he stepped one pace forward and prepared to raise his arm. Even cuffed, he would salute. Even stripped of rank, jacket, and position, he would honor her. He never got the chance. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" came a voice from behind. Officer Corbin, older than Simmons and Kolchak, built like a man who hadn't missed a chance to intimidate someone in years, approached with wide steps and fire in his eyes. Osric didn't turn. He kept his posture. The bagpipes began to play in the distance, their slow, somber notes drifting through the air like the sound of morning itself. Osric's lips parted as if to speak, but then he felt a sudden impact, hard and blinding against his lower back. The electricity hit his body like a wave crashing against stone. His muscles contracted. His breath caught in his throat. The bagpipe's dirge faltered in his ears as his knees buckled beneath him. "Ain't no hero here," Corbin sneered. Osric collapsed. His body hit the ground with a brutal crack, his face slamming against pavement that had already scraped his knees earlier that day. He felt the jolt in his jaw first, followed by the unmistakable metallic taste in his mouth. A tooth had broken. His vision blurred as blood began to pool near his lips, mixing with the fine dust and oil-stained concrete. The pain was immediate and absolute. The cuffs dug into his wrists as he tried instinctively to brace himself, but there was no cushion, no reflex strong enough to soften the landing. Around him, he heard voices again, another officer muttering that he had tensed up and looked like he was charging. Cameras clicked. One person laughed. Guess he got his parade. The bagpipes continued, the song mocking him now with its solemnity. As the hearse passed, the driver glanced out the window and then looked away quickly, saying nothing. Osric couldn't lift his head. The back of his skull rang with dull thunder. Blood ran freely now, down his chin, onto the collar of his shirt. His face pressed against the concrete, tears gathering but not falling, trapped beneath the weight of helplessness. Corbin stood over him, taser still in hand. He moved toward the vehicle. He called out to no one in particular. Had to neutralize. Someone nearby nodded. No one questioned it. A paramedic who had been stationed discreetly for the ceremony slowly walked over, hesitating. He might need stitches, the man said flatly, kneeling beside Osric, checking his pulse with clinical detachment. Bit through his lip, maybe cracked a molar. He'll live, Corbin replied. That's more than some folks can say. Osric tried to open his eyes fully, but the light stung too sharply. He blinked slowly, focusing on the hearse that was now stopped several feet ahead. The doors at the rear opened. Pallbearers emerged once again, lifting the casket as if nothing had happened. As if the man face down in the dirt, bleeding, cuffed, humiliated, was not her husband. As if he wasn't real. The bagpipes swelled one final time before fading into silence. The funeral had moved on. He had been left behind again. The paramedic dabbed at his lip, then wrapped a small cloth under his jaw to slow the bleeding. Try not to talk, he advised quietly. It'll make it worse. Osric nodded slightly. His eyes stayed on the casket. Rosalie had told him she wanted dignity. She had wanted to be remembered with love, grace, and the uniform that had meant everything to their family. But this was degradation. The ceremony was complete now. The priest spoke briefly at the burial site. There was no gun salute, no folded flag, no presentation of colors, just dirt, words, and the echo of forgotten promises. As the crowd dissipated once again, Osric remained on the ground, unmoving, unseen. No charges were filed, no apologies offered, no report read aloud to him. They simply disappeared once they were done with him. As dusk rolled in, Osric remained alone. The flag had been stuffed into a bag by an officer who'd said nothing while doing it, then tossed on the bench as if it were forgotten laundry. His jacket, when finally returned to him, was wrinkled and smelled of cigarettes. The medals were still attached, but someone had turned one upside down as a joke. He didn't bother fixing it. The day had long passed the point of saving. By morning, the story was already reshaped into something grotesque. A local news headline appeared just after sunrise on multiple feeds. Man disrupts private funeral ceremony. Detained by police after causing disturbance. The short article referenced official reports from Belridge Police, stating that the individual, a middle-aged male in military-style attire, had become belligerent after being denied entry due to lack of verification and had physically approached a law enforcement vehicle in an aggressive manner. The piece included vague lines about incoherent shouting, potential impersonation, and non-compliance with safety protocols. There was no mention of a widow, no mention of a folded flag, no mention of blood on the pavement or the sound of bagpipes rising over a man's body. Osric read it twice, his hands trembling slightly as he held his phone. The picture accompanying the story was a crop shot of him being led away, his face twisted slightly from the impact, mouth bloodied, eyes half closed. The caption read, "Incident at Memorial Site involving disruptive attendee." That was what he had become, an incident, a disruption, a footnote. That same day, an internal group chat among Belridge PD officers began circulating screenshots. Simmons posted the first image, a freeze frame from body cam footage showing Osric mid-fall, arms bent awkwardly, flag slipping from his hand. The text over the image read, "Captain Clown reporting for duty." Someone responded with 5 laughing emojis. Another officer added a meme edit of Osric's face pasted over a circus performer, saluting with a red foam nose. One added, "Stolen valor? More like stolen spotlight." LOL. Corbin chimed in late in a thread, typing, "Guy practically tripped over his own ego. We did him a favor. He got a headline, didn't he?" The conversation continued late into the night, an unbroken stream of mockery, self-congratulation, and gallows humor shared among those sworn to protect. None of them feared consequences. None of them considered for a moment that the man they humiliated might one day be heard. But outside their bubble, someone had noticed. a freelance reporter named Maddie Traynor, who covered local human interest stories and had once written a piece about veterans struggling with post-service care, saw the article and felt something didn't add up. The photo of Osric struck her as deeply wrong, not because of what he looked like, but because of what he didn't. His posture wasn't threatening. His uniform wasn't random. And in the background of that image, just barely visible, was a folded flag lying near a curb. She'd covered enough military funerals to recognize what that meant. Maddie reached out to Belridge PD for a statement. She received a short, automated response thanking her for her inquiry and stating, "Due to the ongoing internal review of the incident, we cannot provide further comment at this time." That phrase, ongoing internal review, repeated in the next 5 emails she sent. No one would speak with her. She called the funeral home. No answer. She contacted the chapel. They said they were not authorized to discuss the private details of any past ceremonies. She asked the city clerk for access to incident reports filed that day, only to be told that the records were sealed pending evaluation. It was a closed circle. The doors shut fast. And yet, outside the spotlight, Osric remained very much in the shadows, nursing cracked ribs, a chipped tooth, and the kind of silence that came not from peace, but exhaustion. He had slept upright on his couch the night after the funeral, afraid that if he lay down, his breath would catch and not return. He had not told anyone what had happened. Not yet. He had no immediate family left, no children, no siblings to share the burden with. Rosalie had been his world, and the world had taken her away before he could even say goodbye properly. The uniform still hung by the door. He hadn't dared put it back on. Not because he was ashamed of his service, but because now the fabric carried the echoes of a different battlefield, one he could never explain to anyone who hadn't lived through it. When he stood in front of the bathroom mirror the next day, he touched his bruised lip and saw the small discoloration spreading beneath his cheekbone. He looked like someone who had lost a fight, though no fight had ever been waged. He looked like someone who had been erased while still standing in full view. Maddie continued pushing. She reached out to veterans groups across the state, asking if anyone knew a man named Osric Vance. 2 days later, a retired colonel responded. "Yes, I knew him," the message read. "We served together. He's a decorated officer. Navy Cross. Aegean Rescue Op, 2003. If he's who you're asking about, he's not a threat. He's a hero." But even that threat hit walls. When Maddie submitted a request for the body cam footage under public records law, she was told it was exempt due to potential impact on ongoing investigations. The tooth broken during his fall remained untreated. His mouth still bore the mark of that afternoon's violence, the gash deep enough to keep him from speaking for any length of time without pain. But even if his throat were clear, even if the swelling subsided, what would he say? To whom? The world already had its story, already believed the version sold to them in neat headlines and clipped quotes. He was a problem, not a person. A disruption, not a man. Until 7 minutes passed. 7 minutes after the last image of Osric, dazed and leaning against the wall near the cemetery exit, made its way through a small private thread of local veterans. 7 minutes after a retired colonel saw the meme of Captain Clown and, sickened by the sight, made a call to a number buried deep in an old Rolodex. 7 minutes was all it took for the sound of tires to announce that the story was no longer theirs to control. At first, the onlookers thought it was a funeral motorcade running late. The low rumble of engines turned heads. Then the sound shifted, deepened, hardened into something unmistakable. The kind of sound made only by heavy-duty tactical engines, moving in synchronized precision. The kind of sound not heard on civilian streets unless something serious was about to unfold. From around the corner near Belridge Avenue, a sleek, armored convoy appeared. 3 matte black SUVs, their lights not flashing, but their presence impossible to miss. Each vehicle bore small, subdued insignia, emblems that only those who had served would recognize. The stars, the eagles, the twin swords crossed in solemn reverence. The convoy pulled in silently, engines idling with force. The officers outside the chapel exchanged looks. Simmons stood first, adjusting his belt. Corbin straightened his shoulders, uncertain now, his laughter from earlier frozen in his throat. The passenger door of the lead SUV opened. Out stepped a woman in full-service uniform, ribbons lined with absolute precision, boots polished to a level that made Osric's now scuffed pair look like they'd never seen inspection. Her posture was straight as a sword's edge, her expression unreadable. This was Commandant Amelia Falk. The name wasn't known to the media standing nearby. It wasn't known to most civilians. But to every Marine who had ever faced fire or walked into danger, knowing their name might one day be etched on a memorial wall, Falk's name was more than familiar. It was legend. She was not just the highest-ranking female officer in her division. She was a war-scarred tactician, the architect of 3 major rescue operations, and the only living recipient of the Medal of Valor who had turned down a Pentagon desk in favor of staying with her troops. She stepped forward without hesitation. Behind her, 3 more Marines followed, silent, towering, dressed not in ceremony but in authority. No one spoke, not Simmons, not Kolchak, not even Corbin. They watched as Falk scanned the area, her eyes bypassing the chapel, the groundskeepers, the press. She walked forward toward the perimeter wall, past the bench where Osric's flag still sat abandoned, past the cruiser whose door remained open like a crime scene left mid-act. Then she saw him. Osric was seated low, his back against the stone. He didn't notice the arrival at first. His vision remained downward, unfocused, jaw slack, hands limp on his knees. The injuries had taken their toll, but so had the hours of degradation. Falk knelt beside him without ceremony, without introduction, without the formality that the media so often anticipated when ranking officers addressed a crowd. She said only one word, her voice clear, firm, and deliberately loud enough to reach the microphones that had begun recording in the distance. "Brother." The sound cut through the air like a thunderclap. Osric blinked, slowly turning his head, confused, unsure whether his mind had conjured it from memory. But she was there, kneeling before him, her uniform precise, her gaze unwavering. The press surged forward now, cameras clicking rapidly, recording a moment that none of them understood, but all knew mattered. Falk remained beside him, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder, steady and sure. "Get him up," she said without raising her voice, and 2 Marines stepped forward instantly. They lifted Osric not as detainees lift a suspect, not as men drag the fallen, but as comrades raising one of their own. The posture was deliberate. They held him upright, supported but not restrained. A veteran, a leader, a man whose story deserved the truth. Osric stood now, shoulders hunched slightly from pain, but his chin rising for the first time in days. Falk turned to face the officers, who remained frozen by the SUV. Her eyes scanned the group. "What happened here will be reviewed by a tribunal," she said, voice still calm, but firm enough to make Simmons take a step back. "Until then, none of you speak to the press. None of you touch that man again." Corbin opened his mouth, but said nothing. He had no defense. Kolchak glanced away, as if seeing something far off that could save him. It was a headline waiting to explode. Within minutes of Falk's statement, her communications team, always precise, initiated the pre-approved clearance to declassify select portions of Osric's service file. They had come prepared, not only to defend him, but to make the country remember what it had forgotten. News feeds updated rapidly, each headline carrying more weight than the last. Marine veteran at center of controversy identified as decorated war hero. Navy Cross recipient mistreated at wife's funeral. System failed Osric Vance, a man who rescued dozens under fire. The revelations came like a cascade. Osric had earned not 1, but 2 Purple Hearts. He had been a POW in a remote compound along the Euxine coast for 19 days. He had orchestrated the Aegean rescue operation in 2003, where his tactical decisions led to the safe extraction of 23 civilians trapped behind hostile lines. His Navy Cross citation had been read aloud at a Pentagon ceremony attended by multiple branches, where Rosalie stood beside him, pride flooding her eyes. She had been there the day the flag was folded and presented to her by the Secretary of the Navy. That same flag now bore the filth of a chapel's parking lot. As the media digested these truths, something else happened. Something Fox's team hadn't controlled. A whistleblower from inside the Belridge Police Department leaked raw body cam footage to an anonymous journalist with ties to a national news network. That video went viral within minutes. It was uncut, time-stamped, and irrefutable. The footage opened with Osric standing alone near the chapel gate. His hands were not raised. He was not aggressive. His voice, caught clearly by the officer's mic, was calm. "Please, I just want to bury my wife." He said it slowly, deliberately, not as a demand, but as a plea. Then came the footage of him being forced to kneel. The officers laughing, one snapping a selfie. The moment Simmons yanked his jacket off. The camera angle showed Osric's face as he was pressed to the ground, the folded flag visible beside him. In one segment, he could be heard quietly asking, "Did someone call the funeral director?" He was ignored. In another, Corbin is caught clearly instructing a junior officer to let the clown sweat for a while. The most damning moment came toward the end of the clip, Corbin approaching Osric as he attempted to stand, preparing to salute the hearse. The taser was visible in his hand. He fired without warning. Osric's voice, broken and weak, could be heard whispering again, "Rosie, I'm trying." Then he hit the pavement. Blood followed. The footage stunned the nation. Across screens in homes, restaurants, buses, and military bases, Americans watched a man stripped of his dignity not because he threatened anyone, but because he had been too proud to leave when told he didn't belong. Veterans groups erupted in outrage. Gold Star families issued statements. Congressional leaders, many of whom had served, called emergency meetings. Military social channels flooded with posts calling for accountability. #Justice for Osric began trending within 3 hours of the leak. Fox stood by Osric as the footage aired nationwide. They were in a private recovery room offered by a local veterans clinic. Osric had said little since the funeral. He had not asked for his name to be cleared. He had not called for punishment. He had only asked to be allowed to honor his wife. And when that was denied, he had said nothing more. Until now. He watched the footage with no sound, his eyes focused on the screen but not blinking, hands clasped on his lap, fingers trembling slightly. When it ended, Falk muted the screen and turned to him. "They see it now," she said softly. Osric looked at her, the stiffness in his shoulders beginning to ease. "That's not why I stayed," he whispered. "I wasn't trying to prove anything. I just couldn't let her go like that. I couldn't let them bury her like she was nobody." Falk nodded once. "You didn't. They saw, and they're not going to forget again." Outside, protests began forming, peaceful but insistent. Groups of veterans arrived at Belridge Chapel, many in uniform, standing silently with arms crossed, faces stern. They brought flags, folded properly, carried with reverence. They stood where Osric had once stood, refusing to be moved. Inside the city's administrative offices, emails poured in. Phone lines crashed. The mayor issued a press conference calling the incident deeply concerning, his tone pale with fear. He avoided questions about internal cover-ups. Reporters pressed for resignations. They pressed for arrests. Within 24 hours, Belridge PD released a shaky statement acknowledging that new evidence has emerged and that a full investigation will be conducted. Falk didn't wait for them to act. She coordinated with JAG attorneys, filed formal misconduct complaints, and petitioned for external oversight. Within 72 hours, Corbin and Simmons were placed on administrative leave. Kolchak resigned. The funeral director, under pressure, admitted to canceling Osric's ceremony enhancements due to concerns expressed by officers on site. His license was suspended. Still, none of this reached Osric the way it did the public. He sat quietly as the news spun louder around him. He accepted the support of fellow Marines who arrived to visit, some saluting him silently, others pressing a hand to his shoulder without needing to speak. Foreign news outlets covered Osric Vance's mistreatment not just as a civil rights failure, but as a betrayal of military honor, a universal symbol of what unchecked authority could destroy in plain sight. Military organizations, legal advocacy groups, and political figures from both parties issued statements condemning the abuse. Veterans across the country held coordinated silent vigils, gathering outside courthouses, state buildings, and police departments, holding up Osric's photograph beside images of their own fallen, all under the banner of #DignityIsNotOptional. Behind the scenes, investigative journalists unearthed decades-old documents and internal files that had been locked under the guise of privacy and protocol. Among them was Officer Corbin's personnel file, obtained from a leak server that had been quietly maintained by the city's police oversight board. What the file revealed detonated like a bomb across national headlines. Corbin had been the subject of no fewer than 12 formal complaints over the span of his career, ranging from the excessive use of force to racist language and intimidation of minority youth. Each complaint had either been dismissed or buried, shielded by union attorneys and enabled by administrative loopholes. One complaint alleged that Corbin had once slammed a teen against a patrol car for smiling the wrong way, resulting in 3 fractured ribs. Another described him forcing a veteran with PTSD to the ground during a wellness check. None had resulted in meaningful discipline. The records were time-stamped, signed, and sealed, but now exposed. When reporters confronted the Belridge police chief, his weak response, claiming due process was always followed, only made things worse. The state's attorney general ordered an immediate review. That same morning, a warrant was issued for Corbin's arrest on charges of assault, falsification of records, and violation of civil rights under color of law. He never showed up to his shift. His department-issued vehicle was found abandoned 5 miles from the station. Helicopters flew overhead. Units were dispatched. He had gone to ground, but not for long. Hours later, a local television crew covering the protests outside City Hall spotted a man in partial uniform moving between parked cars in the city garage. The footage captured the moment live, Corbin, sweat pouring from his forehead, attempting to make his way to a nondescript vehicle while keeping his face hidden beneath a hooded sweatshirt pulled over his badge. Within minutes, he was surrounded. The camera zoomed in as he was handcuffed by state troopers, his face twisted in disbelief, his mouth opening to protest before closing again, realizing there were no words that could undo the damage. As they led him to the cruiser, chants rose from the crowd gathered nearby. Some shouted Osric's name. Others said nothing at all, simply holding up their hands in silent condemnation. The footage aired live on national television. Corbin had humiliated a man in front of the world. Now the world was watching him fall. The fallout didn't end there. Belridge's police chief, under immense pressure, resigned that afternoon. The mayor, who had tried to distance himself from the department's actions, found his own words dissected and weaponized against him. His budget records were pulled, his campaign donors exposed. By evening, he too stepped down, issuing a pre-written statement claiming he wanted to give the city a chance to heal. The community wasn't interested in healing just yet. They wanted truth. They wanted change. The governor, who had remained largely silent up to this point, finally stood before cameras at the state capitol. His expression was grave, his words carefully chosen. What happened to Captain Vance is what happens when we choose power over humanity. When institutions forget their purpose and individuals forget their oath. No American should have to earn their right to be treated with dignity, especially not someone who has already sacrificed everything. The speech went viral. It was replayed on every major network, taught in classrooms, quoted by activists. Within hours, state officials announced a sweeping review of police conduct cases going back 15 years. Subpoenas were issued. Records were unsealed. But amid the chaos, Osric Vance remained largely silent. He had returned to the Veterans Clinic, flanked still by a small team of Marines who rotated watch over him as if on deployment. Commandant Falk stayed close, managing media, filtering requests, and making sure no one reached him without going through her. Osric didn't care about the press. He didn't care about the politics. He cared only about whether Rosalie's grave had been properly tended, whether her marker bore the right name, whether anyone would visit her knowing what had been taken from them both. The day Corbin was arrested, Falk sat beside Osric in the courtyard of the clinic, the flag he'd carried now properly cleaned and refolded, resting between them. She handed him a tablet, showing him the footage. Corbin being cuffed, reporters shouting questions, protesters standing in solemn silence, as the man who had once knelt Osric on gravel now found himself on the other end of justice. Osric watched the video in full. When it ended, he closed the tablet and sat still for several minutes. Then, quietly, he said, "Rosalie would have told me not to be bitter, but I'm not sure I know how not to be." Falk nodded. The morning air outside the clinic had shifted from cold gray to something gentler, the kind of early warmth that softened even concrete underfoot. It had been over a week since the world found out the truth about Osric Vance, a week since the headlines stopped labeling him a disruptive attendee and started calling him by his name, his rank, and the history that came with both. The system that tried to erase him had been dragged into light, its cracks exposed, its defenders fleeing the consequences they once thought would never reach them. Officer Corbin remained in custody awaiting arraignment. His bond had been denied. Kolchak's resignation had been accepted quietly, his badge returned without ceremony. The mayor had gone silent. The police department was under review. Commandant Falk had refused to leave town, staying stationed at the clinic and attending every oversight committee meeting like a soldier standing watch. Veterans continued to gather outside City Hall every day, not protesting violently, but simply being visible, reminding the world that dignity was not a privilege, it was a debt. Inside the clinic, Osric Vance had begun speaking again, though sparingly. The swelling in his face had subsided. The cuts had begun to close. His tooth would need replacement, but he delayed the procedure for reasons he didn't explain. When asked, he said little more than, "It's not time yet." He still wore civilian clothes, loose-fitting and soft, nothing like the rigid formality of his dress blues. His medals had been returned in a velvet case, cleaned and reset, but he hadn't touched them. The folded flag sat on the windowsill of his room, perfectly shaped, facing east toward the sunrise. That morning, as the sun crept higher, there was a knock at the clinic's private entrance. The Marine stationed at the door didn't recognize the visitor at first. The man was out of uniform. He wore jeans and a plain windbreaker, his hands in his pockets, his eyes downcast like someone not sure whether he should have come at all. He identified himself quietly, Officer Simmons. The Marine didn't move immediately. When Falk was alerted, she asked only one question, "Is he alone?" When she was told yes, she didn't order him turned away. She simply said, "If Captain Vance allows it, he can speak." Osric was seated in the small courtyard behind the clinic, the flag beside him as always, his gaze following the pattern of birds cutting through the pale blue sky. When Falk approached and relayed the request, he didn't flinch. He didn't sigh. He didn't ask why. He simply nodded once. The Marine waved Simmons through the rear gate. The officer walked slowly, his steps unsure, like every footfall might trigger something unseen. When he finally reached Osric, he didn't speak right away. He didn't sit. He stood 5 feet away, hands still in his pockets, looking at the ground. Osric didn't turn to face him. Simmons cleared his throat once, the sound dry and tight. "I didn't come to ask for anything," he said, voice lower than usual. He stopped, swallowed hard, then continued. "When I was a kid, my dad had this friend who served. Real tough guy. Used to tell stories about the Marines. He'd come over during the holidays. Showed me how to iron my shirts like a uniform. Told me to always respect the ones who served because they did the things the rest of us couldn't." His words came faster now, tumbling. "I don't know what happened that day. I mean, I do, I was there, but I don't know why I didn't stop it. I thought you were, I don't know. Someone looking to make a scene. We get those sometimes. I didn't see a man. I saw a headline I'd already written in my head." Osric remained still. Simmons finally looked up, eyes red-rimmed, jaw clenched. "I didn't know it was your wife's funeral. I didn't know who you were. But it shouldn't have mattered. I shouldn't have needed a name or a ribbon to treat you like a human being." Silence settled between them like dust. Simmons shifted, suddenly kneeling without ceremony, his hands dropping to the pavement. "I'm sorry," he said, voice cracking, "for everything. Osric turned now slowly, his face calm but unreadable. He looked at Simmons, studied him like a puzzle with too many pieces missing. Then finally he spoke. "You don't have to kneel," he said. His voice was hoarse but steady, deliberate. "Just remember next time." Simmons nodded, unable to speak. He stood slowly, backed away, and left without another word. Falk watched from the far end of the courtyard. She approached Osric once Simmons had disappeared through the gate. "You didn't have to see him," she said. Osric nodded. "I know." She paused, then asked, "Why'd you let him come?" Osric didn't answer right away. He turned back toward the flag. "Because if he walks away, still thinking I'm just a headline, then nothing changes. But if he remembers my face every time he puts on that badge, maybe next time he stops it." Falk nodded, understanding. The press never found out about the visit. No cameras caught it. No article covered it. It wasn't staged. It wasn't performative. It was what change looked like when no one was watching. In the weeks that followed, Belridge passed a reform bill requiring third-party oversight of all police complaints. A new civilian review board was established. Veteran organizations were added as advisory liaisons. Osric never stood at a podium. He never gave a speech, but his presence was felt in every sentence of that bill. They called it the Vance Reform. At Rosalie's grave, the city finally held the full military ceremony she had requested. Marines stood in formation. A bugler played taps. A 21-gun salute echoed across the cemetery, this time not silenced by exclusion but amplified by truth. Falk handed Osric the newly folded flag, pristine and sharp. This time, he took it with both hands. As he placed it gently on the grave, he whispered something only the wind could hear. In the distance, school children were brought to watch, to learn about respect, honor, and what happens when those are denied. Osric Vance walked away quietly. He didn't need applause. He didn't need revenge. What he needed was exactly what he'd been denied at the beginning, the simple right to grieve with dignity. He had it now. And because he did, others would too. The end. If this story moved you, let us know by liking and subscribing. It helps bring more stories like this to life. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the plot. Which moment hit hardest for you? What did you think about Osric's quiet strength and the arc of justice that finally caught up with those who wronged him? Also, where are you watching from? Drop a comment and tell us your city or country. We're building a global community of story lovers here, and your voice matters.